On the morning of Tuesday, May 24th, in a tragedy that is so often repeated in the United States, Salvador Rolando Romez, an 18-year-old resident of Uvalde, Texas, shot his grandmother in the face. At 11:28 a.m., Romez crashed his vehicle in a ditch nearby the Robb Elementary School. Shortly after, witnesses reported seeing a man emerge from the vehicle with tactical gear and an AR-15 assault weapon. The man then entered the school through an open side door. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, the gunman, who himself was killed, would leave behind a scene of carnage, killing 19 school children and 2 teachers. The Uvalde school shooting sparked calls from across the United States for Congress to enact stricter gun control measures. In a scathing yet resounding address to the nation that same night, a visibly angry and distraught President Joe Biden said, "Wearing God's name is our backbone." In a plea to Congress to act on gun control, Biden added, "As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? When in God's name do we do what we all know in our gut needs to be done? I am sick and tired of it. We have to act. And don't tell me we can't have an impact on this carnage." In this episode of Jake's Political Take, I'm going to explain the history and significance of the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. I will also argue, although unfortunate it may be, that the U.S. is unlikely to have any meaningful gun control at the federal level in the near future. So, starting off, what is the Second Amendment? The text of the Second Amendment reads as this: "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." According to the Legal Information Institute at Cornell University's Law School, there are 2 interpretations which can be derived from the Second Amendment's wording. Some constitutional experts, pointing to the wording of the former part of the amendment, which again states, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state," argue that the Second Amendment does not guarantee the rights of individual citizens to possess firearms. Rather, it limits Congress's ability to legislate on the issue of the defense of individual states in the U.S., i.e., the various National Guards, which in most cases is a military-style armed guard controlled by the state government rather than the federal government. This is known as the so-called collective rights theory. The second interpretation, which can be referred to as the individual right theory, derives its understanding of the Second Amendment from the latter part, which states, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." According to the proponents of this interpretation, the Second Amendment restricts Congress's ability to legislate on the individual's right to own guns. In order for us to fully understand the Second Amendment and gun control in the U.S., it is necessary for us to delve a bit into the history of how American courts have interpreted the Second Amendment. As David Yatsky, an American constitutional lawyer and politician, states in his article, "The Second Amendment, Structure, History, and Constitutional Change" in the Michigan Law Review, for years, American courts interpreted the Second Amendment through the collective rights theory. This was confirmed in a 1939 United States Supreme Court decision known as United States v. Miller. Jack Miller and Frank Layton were charged with illegally transporting an unregistered shotgun across state lines. Miller and Layton argued that the law prohibiting the transfer of unregistered firearms across state boundaries violated the Second Amendment and was therefore unconstitutional. A district court agreed with the 2 defendants. However, the government appealed the ruling directly to the Supreme Court. the Supreme Court found that the law was not unconstitutional, as barring the transportation of unregistered firearms across state boundaries did not interfere with the state's right to, quote, a well-regulated militia. As Yaski argues, in the 1980s, an increasing number of academics who specialized in the U.S. Constitution began to interpret the Second Amendment through the so-called individual rights theory, which argues that the amendment guarantees individuals the right to possess firearms. According to Yaski, the pivotal moment came in 1989, when Sanford Levinson argued in an article that the Second Amendment seriously restricted legislative assemblies' ability to restrict the purchase and possession of firearms for individuals. Subsequent court decisions began to reflect this new interpretation. Most notable was the 2008 U.S. Supreme Court decision in the District of Columbia v. Heller. The city of Washington, D.C. had a handgun in place. Heller argued that this prohibition on the possession of handguns was unconstitutional. In its decision, the Supreme Court agreed with Heller, thus overturning the handgun ban in Washington, D.C. Since District of Columbia v. Heller, courts have used this new interpretation to strike down laws which attempt to restrict individuals' ability to purchase firearms. For example, in 2022, a federal appeals court ruled that a California law which banned the sale of semi-automatic weapons to those under the age of 21 was unconstitutional. This new interpretation of the Second Amendment, using the individual rights theory, has also allowed Republicans in Congress to argue that any new gun legislation would be unconstitutional. This, coupled with another factor which I'll get into later, is why the U.S. is unlikely to have any meaningful gun control in the near future. So let's go over a bit about the history of gun control in the United States, because the U.S. actually does have a history of legislating who can sell and purchase firearms, and it is really only recently that efforts to increase gun control has hit a stone wall. So, the law which Miller had argued was unconstitutional in United States v. Miller was the 1934 National Firearms Act, implemented after a spate of mafia crime involving gun violence. The National Firearms Act made registration compulsory on the transfer of certain guns. The 1939 Supreme Court decision upheld this law, and through its interpretation of the Second Amendment, allowed the U.S. federal government to further legislate on the sale, transfer, and possession of firearms. Another significant milestone in the regulation of firearms in the U.S. was the Gun Control Act of 1968, which, among other things, prohibited certain people from owning or purchasing a gun, including convicted felons, those deemed to be quote-unquote mentally incompetent, and drug addicts. The 1993 Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act requires background checks to be completed on prospective gun buyers, and the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act banned the sale of assault weapons between 1994 and 2004. Congress has since tried to renew this ban, however, subsequent efforts have failed. When Democrats and gun control advocates talk about increasing background checks for the purchasing of firearms, they are referring primarily to a gap in U.S. federal legislation governing gun purchases, known as the so-called private sale exemption, or, as it is often referred to, as the gun show loophole. As previously mentioned, the 1993 Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act legislated that prospective gun buyers must undergo a background check. However, this only applies if the buyer is buying a firearm from a gun shop or a licensed gun vendor. If the purchaser is buying a gun from a private individual, there is no federal law requiring a background check take place before the sale happens. The only stipulation under federal law is that the seller must not have a reasonable belief that the buyer is prohibited from owning a firearm. There are only 14 states which legislate background checks for private gun sales. Another change which gun control advocates have been calling for is an assault rifle ban. Between 1994 and 2004, there was a ban in place at the federal level which prohibited the sale of assault weapons. This ban expired in 2004. There were subsequent efforts to renew it, however, all of these have failed. To outside observers, these two measures, increased background checks and a complete ban on the sale of assault rifles, just seems like common sense gun policy. And in fact, most Americans would agree with this. Polling done by the Pew Research Center in 2021 showed that 81% of Americans either somewhat favor or strongly favor making background checks compulsory for the private sale of firearms. In the same poll, 63% of Americans either somewhat favored or strongly favored a complete ban on all assault weapons. So, that leads us to the question, if there is broad support in the U.S. for these two measures, why, then, has Congress failed to act? There was a very interesting argument made in an article in The Atlantic by Ronald Brownstein, a senior political analyst at both The Atlantic and CNN. As he points out, when explaining why stricter gun control hasn't been enacted in the U.S., most people point to the influence of the NRA and other gun lobbyists. However, as he argues, the influence of the gun lobby has been slowly declining in the U.S. in recent years, although it is still not negligible. Instead, Brownstein claims that there is a different culprit preventing common sense gun control, what he terms, and I quote, the growing crisis of majority rule in American politics, and specifically, or this arises from, the Senate's filibuster rule, which he argues gives an undue amount of influence to a small minority of states in the U.S. So, what is the Senate filibuster rule? The filibuster rule is a measure which requires at least 60 votes in the U.S. Senate for debate on an issue in the chamber to come to a close and for a vote to proceed. For a bill to be passed into law, though, a bill only needs to receive 50 plus 1 votes. The filibuster rule was initially instituted in 1806 under the advice of Vice President Aaron Burr. The goal of the filibuster was to ensure that debate in the Senate was not prematurely ended. It has only been recently that it has been used to prolong debate and prevent a bill from being voted on. This is why, in spite of the fact that the Democrats currently control a majority of seats in the Senate, gun control legislation is unlikely to be passed. This is why there is so often legislative deadlock in the U.S. The filibuster could be overturned. However, the fear from both the Republicans and the Democrats that one day they will be in the minority in the chamber prevents either party from doing so. This is why, as Brownstein claims, there is a, quote, crisis of majority rule in the U.S., because, essentially, for any bill to become law, it requires 60 senators to vote in favor. So I was trying to find a way to connect this issue to Canadian politics and Canadian current events, and then it just so happened, while I was preparing this week's episode, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal government announced a new gun control-related bill. So I'm going to go over that bill in this segment. So first, what is this bill? This is a far-reaching new bill, much of which I think is good. So first, let's go over what I think is good. There is a pledge by the government to institute a mandatory buyback program for banned assault firearms. Previously, the buyback had been voluntary. And a buyback program, just to let you know, is when the government purchases previously allowed, now banned guns from their owners at a predetermined price and then usually destroys them. There is also new legislation which would mandate that those determined to be a threat to themselves or others forfeit their firearms. And the bill will also increase from 10 years to 14 years the maximum penalty for certain gun-related crimes, including the trafficking of firearms. All of these measures are common sense gun policies. A person living in an industrial Western society has no need for an assault rifle, and someone deemed a threat to their community and to society should not possess any sort of firearm. What is more controversial, however, is the government's pledge in its new bill to make the sale and purchase of handguns illegal. While not outright banning them, it will essentially cap the market and grandfather handguns slowly out of Canadian society. So, now it's time for my take. First, I will give you my take on Trudeau's bill, and then I will give you my take on gun control in the US. So, Trudeau's bill, and specifically the handgun element. So, a handgun ban has been something that has been proposed previously, especially one that would specifically target handguns in large municipalities. Toronto Mayor John Tory has advocated in the past for the federal government to introduce a handgun ban in the city of Toronto, and Montreal's mayor has advocated for something similar there. A handgun ban is something that I have gone back and forth on quite a bit. I've sort of been on the fence. Originally, I supported it, but now not so much, and I will give you my reasoning behind that. So, first of all, I want to point out that in Canada, the vast majority of gun-related violence and homicide is as a result of handguns. The fact of the matter is that Canada does not have the same issues with mass shootings involving assault rifles as the US does. Even in the 2020 Nova Scotia mass shooting, in which 23 people were killed, which involved the use of assault rifles, these weapons were illegally acquired from the US. Now, that's not to totally negate mass shootings in Canada. I'm just saying that it is not as much of an issue, and the fact that the Nova Scotia shooter acquired his weapons from the US is not to negate the necessity of an assault weapons ban in Canada. As I said earlier, nobody in an industrialized society needs to own an assault weapon. However, I think that handguns are a bit different. Already in Canada, there are numerous restrictions around the purchase, use, and transportation of handguns. In Canada, under the federal government's Firearms Act, most handguns are considered to be restricted, meaning that in order to purchase one, or to purchase ammo for one, you must have a license. And in order to get a license, you have to go through a background check, agree to have your information inputted into the National Gun Registry, and you must also take a compulsory firearms safety course. As well, you must renew your license every 5 years. These are good policies. If you wish to own any sort of firearm, society has the right to know that you are mentally sane and a responsible individual. Now, I want to point out that I don't like guns. I don't really think that any sort of gun has a place in modern society. However, in saying that, we do live in a society, and there are individuals who own guns because they enjoy sport shooting, whatever that may be. And I believe that as a society, we must find a balance. Now, as I said, the vast majority of gun-related crime in Canada does involve handguns. However, 70% of crime involving handguns involves guns that have been smuggled into Canada from the US, which, I want to add, is why Canadians should care about the gun control issue in the US, because it directly affects us. In other words, handgun owners who legally purchase their firearm in Canada are not the ones, in the vast majority of cases, committing crime. This is another reason why I do not support an outright ban on the sale of handguns, because it is just not common sense gun policy. Handgun owners who acquired their guns lawfully would have to be pretty stupid to commit a crime using that gun, because the first thing police do when a crime happens involving a gun is check the National Gun Registry. This freeze on the sale of handguns is just a virtue signaling move by the Trudeau government, which will have little, if any, effect on violent crime in Canada. If the government wishes to actually tackle the issue of gun violence in Canada, they must increase measures to prevent illegal gun smuggling from the U.S. My opinion on gun control in the U.S. is much less complicated. The U.S. must implement background checks on the sale of all guns. They must introduce a national gun registry, and they must pass legislation banning all assault-style weapons. That is just common sense gun policy. Now, there is something that I want to point out, an argument that is often made by American opponents of stricter gun control policies. That argument is that it is a mental health crisis, not a gun crisis. Okay then, what do you propose we do to fix this mental health crisis? An argument so often made by Republicans in the U.S., but they never have a viable solution for how they will combat this mental health crisis. Now, I have no doubt that mental health plays a role in mass shootings. No sane person is going to walk into a school or a church or a mosque and kill innocent people. However, the simplest way to prevent this from reoccurring over and over again is to simply ban the sale of certain guns and to increase background checks. Even though I think that the U.S. must enact stricter gun control laws, I do not see a realistic chance of this happening in the near future. The U.S. judicial system, for the most part, now interprets the Second Amendment through the individual rights theory, meaning that individuals have a right to possess firearms. This, coupled with the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court currently has a majority of conservative justices, makes it unlikely, in my opinion, that any new legislation brought forward by Congress would survive a challenge in court. Furthermore, with the filibuster rule in the Senate, it is unlikely that Congress will even be able to pass any further stricter gun control laws. Thank you for listening to this episode of Jake's Political Take. If you'd like to reach me, you may do so at jakespoliticaltake@gmail.com. Please follow me on social media, where I announce the release of new shows and keep you updated on the week's news. I'm on Instagram at Jake's Political Take and Twitter at Jake's Politicals. Stay tuned for next week's episode.